Welcome to Danger, the channel where we dive into the world's most chilling true crime stories. Please like, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can get notified every time we post something. Lori Vallow Daybell is at the center of one of the most complicated and disturbing criminal cases in recent American history. What began as an investigation into two missing children eventually uncovered a series of deaths, secret relationships, extreme religious beliefs, and alleged murder conspiracies stretching across the states of Arizona and Idaho. The case captured international attention because of the identities of the victims, the unusual beliefs of the people involved, and the extraordinary timeline connecting the deaths. Lori Vallow was a mother of two children, Tylee Ryan and Joshua J.J. Vallow. She had been married several times and had moved between different states during her adult life. For many years, there was little indication that her family would eventually become the center of one of the biggest true crime investigations in the United States. That changed as her marriage to her fourth husband, Charles Vallow, began to fall apart and Lori became increasingly involved with a man named Chad Daybell. Charles Vallow was Lori's fourth husband. The couple had married in 2006 and eventually lived in Arizona with their children. JJ had been adopted by Lori and Charles, while Tylee was Lori's teenage daughter from an earlier relationship. Charles and Lori appeared to have built a family together, but their relationship eventually became deeply troubled. During the later stages of their marriage, Lori began expressing increasingly unusual religious beliefs. These beliefs became especially important after she met Chad Daybell. Chad was an author from Idaho who had written books about religious and apocalyptic subjects. He had developed a belief system involving spiritual forces, the end of the world, and the idea that certain people could be classified according to whether they were spiritually good or evil. Lori and Chad eventually became extremely close. Their relationship became romantic even though Lori was still married to Charles and Chad was still married to his wife, Tammy Daybell. Prosecutors would later argue that their relationship, combined with their religious beliefs and financial interests, provided a motive for the events that followed. One of the most important parts of the case involved Lori's daughter, Tylee Ryan. Tylee was born in 2002 and was 16 years old in 2019. She was described by family members as a loving teenager who was close to her family. In September 2019, Tylee traveled with Lori, JJ and Lori's brother Alex Cox to Yellowstone National Park. Photographs from that trip would later become some of the last known images of Tylee alive. After that trip, Tylee disappeared from public view. What made the situation increasingly concerning was that her disappearance was not immediately reported to police. At the same time, JJ's whereabouts were also becoming difficult for family members to establish. JJ Vallow was 7 years old in 2019. He had autism and required care and supervision. His grandparents, Larry and Kay Woodcock, were close to him and became increasingly concerned when they were unable to communicate with him. Kay eventually contacted authorities because she could not get satisfactory answers about where her grandson was. Police went to Lori's home in Rexburg, Idaho, expecting to find JJ. Instead, they discovered that he was not there. Lori provided explanations about where he was, but investigators were unable to verify them. As police continued asking questions, concerns about both children grew. The situation became even more complicated because Lori and Chad had left Idaho. They eventually traveled to Hawaii, where they married in November 2019. Chad was still legally married to Tammy Daybell at that time, and Tammy had died only weeks earlier. Tammy Daybell was Chad's first wife. She was 49 years old and had been married to Chad for many years. Her death in October 2019 was initially not treated as a homicide. However, after investigators began looking into the disappearance of JJ and Tylee, questions surrounding Tammy's death became increasingly important. The timing was extraordinary. Charles Vallow had died in Arizona in July 2019. Tylee was last publicly documented in September. Tammy died in October. Lori and Chad married in Hawaii in November. JJ was missing. And then, in December, Lori's brother Alex Cox died. Alex Cox was a particularly important figure in the investigation. He had been present when Charles Vallow was killed, and investigators later examined his movements and phone records in connection with the deaths of JJ and Tylee. Cox himself died in December 2019. His death was investigated, and the official determination was that he died from a blood clot. Because he was dead, he could never stand trial for any of the allegations surrounding the other deaths. By early 2020, the disappearance of JJ and Tylee had become a national story. Family members were publicly asking where the children were. Police were investigating Lori and Chad's movements and attempting to determine what had happened to the children. Lori was eventually arrested in Hawaii in February 2020. She was extradited to Idaho, where the legal proceedings against her began. Initially, the charges involved allegations relating to the children's disappearance and child abandonment. But the case changed dramatically after investigators searched Chad Daybell's property. In June 2020, investigators searching Chad's property in Rexburg discovered human remains. The remains were later identified as those of Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow. The discovery finally answered the question that investigators and the children's families had been asking for months. The children were dead. The discovery also transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a homicide investigation. Investigators now had to determine not only who was responsible for the deaths of the children, but also how the deaths were connected to the other people who had died during the same period. The prosecution eventually developed a theory involving Lori and Chad's religious beliefs. According to evidence presented in court, Lori and Chad had developed a system in which people could be classified as spiritually light or dark. One of the most controversial terms associated with their belief system was zombie. Prosecutors argued that this terminology was used to describe people who were supposedly controlled by dark spirits. It is important to distinguish between unusual religious beliefs and criminal conduct. Holding unconventional beliefs is not itself a crime. The prosecution's argument was that these beliefs became relevant because they allegedly influenced how Lori and Chad viewed certain people in their lives and helped provide a justification for actions that eventually resulted in deaths. Prosecutors argued that Lori and Chad's relationship was also a major factor. They were romantically involved while both were still married to other people. According to the prosecution, Charles and Tammy became obstacles to the future Lori and Chad wanted together. Charles Vallow's death was one of the first major events in the sequence. On July 11, 2019, Charles went to the Arizona home where Lori was staying. Alex Cox was also there. During a confrontation, Cox shot Charles. Cox told authorities that he had acted in self-defense. At the time, Cox was not charged with murder. But after the investigation into Lori and Chad expanded, prosecutors revisited the circumstances surrounding Charles's death. They eventually alleged that Lori had been involved in a conspiracy to kill him. The prosecution also examined financial issues, including Charles's life insurance. Prosecutors argued that money, along with Lori's relationship with Chad, contributed to the motive. Lori disputed the allegations and maintained that she had not conspired to have Charles killed. Tammy Daybell's death became another critical part of the investigation. When investigators later exhumed Tammy's body, an autopsy determined that her death was a homicide. This was a major turning point because it connected the deaths in Arizona with the deaths being investigated in Idaho. The investigation eventually led prosecutors to charge Lori with the murders of JJ and Tylee and with conspiracy to murder Tammy. Lori's trial took place in Idaho in 2023. The trial lasted several weeks and involved testimony from numerous witnesses. Prosecutors presented evidence concerning Lori's relationships, Chad's beliefs, phone records, communications and the movements of people connected to the case. One of the important elements was evidence concerning Alex Cox's movements and his phone activity. The prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. Rather than one piece of evidence explaining the entire case, prosecutors presented many different pieces and asked the jury to consider how they fit together. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of that evidence. Lori's attorneys argued that the state had not proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt and disputed the prosecution's characterization of Lori's beliefs and relationships. After hearing the evidence, the jury found Lori guilty of murdering Tylee Ryan, murdering Joshua, J.J. Vallow, and conspiring to murder Tammy Daybell. She was also convicted of grand theft related to government benefits associated with the children. The convictions meant that Lori was legally responsible for the deaths of her 2 children and for the conspiracy involving Tammy Daybell. In July 2023, Lori was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murder and conspiracy convictions, along with additional prison time for the theft-related conviction. However, Lori's case was not the only prosecution to come out of the investigation. Chad Daybell was separately prosecuted in Idaho. His trial took place in 2024, and prosecutors presented evidence concerning all 3 deaths: Tammy Daybell, Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow. The prosecution argued that Chad played a central role in the belief system shared by him and Lori and that he participated in the crimes. The defense disputed those allegations and challenged the state's interpretation of the evidence. On May 30, 2024, a jury found Chad guilty of murdering Tammy, Tylee and J.J. He was also convicted of conspiracy charges and insurance fraud. The following day, the jury recommended the death penalty. Chad was formally sentenced to death on June 1, 2024. Although Lori had already been convicted in Idaho, the legal story continued in Arizona. Arizona prosecutors were investigating the death of Charles Vallow as well as an incident involving Lori's niece's former husband, Brandon Boudreaux. Brandon had been married to Melanie Pawlowski, who was Lori's niece. In October 2019, someone fired at Brandon's vehicle outside his home in Gilbert, Arizona. Brandon survived. Investigators eventually connected the shooting to Alex Cox. Prosecutors alleged that Lori was involved in a conspiracy to kill Brandon. The case became connected to the complicated family relationships surrounding Lori, Melanie, Alex and Charles. Lori was eventually brought to trial in Arizona for the alleged conspiracy involving Charles. In this case, she represented herself rather than being represented by a lawyer. Prosecutors presented evidence concerning her relationship with Charles, her relationship with Chad, and communications and circumstances surrounding the period before Charles's death. On April 22, 2025, an Arizona jury found Lori guilty of conspiring to commit first-degree murder in connection with Charles Vallow's death. Lori then faced another Arizona case involving Brandon Boudreaux. Prosecutors alleged that she had conspired with Alex Cox to have Brandon killed. Brandon survived the shooting, but the prosecution argued that Lori was nevertheless criminally responsible for the alleged conspiracy. In 2025, Lori was found guilty of that conspiracy as well. She therefore had 2 additional murder conspiracy convictions in Arizona. On July 25, 2025, Lori was sentenced in Arizona to 2 life sentences connected to the conspiracy convictions. Those sentences were ordered to follow her Idaho sentences. By this point, Lori had been convicted in 2 different states in connection with multiple deaths and alleged murder conspiracies. Despite those convictions, the legal process is not necessarily finished. Lori has appealed her Idaho convictions. Her appellate lawyers have raised several arguments concerning the trial, including issues involving her constitutional rights, legal representation, evidence and other procedural matters. In 2025, her attorneys filed an extensive opening brief with the Idaho Supreme Court, and further filings followed. As of 2026, her Idaho convictions remain in place while the appeal proceeds. An appeal does not mean that a defendant has been declared innocent. It is a legal process in which an appellate court considers whether significant errors occurred during the original proceedings. The case has also left a lasting impact on the families involved. J.J. was only 7 years old when he died. Tylee was just 16. Tammy was 49. Charles was 62. Their deaths affected parents, grandparents, siblings, children and extended family members who were forced to live through years of uncertainty and courtroom proceedings. For J.J.'s grandparents, the disappearance of their grandson became a desperate search for answers. They repeatedly asked where J.J. was and pushed authorities to investigate. For Tylee's loved ones, The disappearance of a teenage girl who had once been seen traveling with her family became an unbearable mystery. The case also demonstrated how seemingly separate events can eventually become connected. At first, Charles's death appeared to be a separate Arizona incident. Tammy's death appeared to be another tragedy in Idaho. JJ and Tylee were simply reported missing. Alex Cox died months later. But once investigators began examining the people, phone records, movements, relationships and communications connecting these individuals, the separate events began to form a much larger picture. The timeline is one of the reasons the case became so widely discussed. Charles died in July 2019. Tylee was last publicly documented in September. Tammy died in October. Lori and Chad married in Hawaii in November. JJ was missing. Alex died in December. Lori was arrested in February 2020. The children's remains were discovered in June 2020. Lori was convicted in Idaho in 2023. Chad was convicted and sentenced to death in 2024. Lori was then convicted in Arizona in 2025 and received additional life sentences. For many people following the case, one of the most difficult aspects to understand is how the events could have happened while the children were surrounded by adults who were supposed to protect them. The prosecution's explanation was that Lori's relationship with Chad, their shared belief system, and their desire to build a new life together created a situation in which people around them were allegedly categorized as obstacles or threats. The defense has rejected important parts of that interpretation, and Lori continues to challenge her convictions through the courts. Ultimately, the Lori Vallow Daybell case is not just about the sensational headlines surrounding a so-called doomsday mom. At its heart, it is about two children who disappeared, families who spent months demanding answers, and an investigation that eventually revealed a much larger chain of events. The case also raises difficult questions about manipulation, belief, relationships, money, family conflict and the ways in which people can become isolated from those around them. The prosecution presented one explanation for how all of these factors came together. Lori's defense has challenged that explanation. Juries in Idaho and Arizona ultimately found her guilty. For JJ and Tylee's families, however, no verdict can change the fact that two children were lost. The convictions provided legal answers, but they could never undo the tragedy. As of 2026, Lori Vallow Daybell remains incarcerated while her appeals continue. Chad Daybell remains under his Idaho death sentence while his own legal proceedings continue. The story that began with two missing children has therefore entered another chapter, the appeals process. The Lori Vallow Daybell case remains one of the most extraordinary criminal cases in recent American history because of the number of people involved, the overlapping relationships, the unusual belief system at the center of the prosecution's theory, and the extraordinary sequence of events that unfolded between 2019 and 2025. And perhaps the most haunting part of the entire story is that when investigators first began asking, "Where are JJ and Tylee?" nobody yet knew how many other questions would eventually have to be answered. Thank you for watching. If you want more factual and respectful true crime content, please like, subscribe, and share. And as always, stay safe.